Good. Great. So I can say that now we'll get started. So hello again, everybody. As Robbie said, welcome to the third of our series of webinars. Today we're going to look at the subject and build on what we've looked at over the last two sessions, really looking at how we can improve the process of testing during agile software development life cycles. So we'll do some introductory slides and background as usual, and then I'll hand over to Robbie for a demonstration of ProcedureCapture and actually see where we can see how support for agile software development life cycles has been built in. And we'll have some time for questions at the end, so if you have any questions, please do type them in the appropriate box and we'll cover them at the end. Okay, Robbie, if we can go to the next slide. That's me. Let's not dwell on how long I've been doing all of this. It gets terrible in the end. So let's crack on. Let's go on. So for those of you in the industry who've been involved with testing over the years, specifically in support of validation in the life sciences, many of you will know that computer systems validation started off when we looked at validating process control and automation systems, starting back in the 1990s. This was following a series of FDA inspections. And all of those validation activities are typically aligned with the work we do to qualify process plant and equipment. And that can certainly work very well because we tend to follow a linear process with verification at every step in the process. So typically we will have design qualification, installation, operation, performance qualification of the process, the plant and equipment. And that works very well because typically when we're building a new manufacturing plant, we have time to finalize those specifications, to review and approve them before we move on to the next stage in the process. And it's also very important that we do that because if you make an error in the design of our process plant, it can obviously be very expensive to rectify retrospectively. So we tend to put a lot more time into design review and qualification, and that's very important from a cost perspective. Now that approach aligns very well with a waterfall software development lifecycle. So in the early versions of the Gantt guide, where we saw the original V model, we saw user requirements translated into functional specifications, into detailed design specifications. Typically those steps were aligned with the design review and qualification of the process plant or equipment, and then our various phases of formal testing were aligned against each of those requirement documents. And that worked well, and it's an approach that's still perfectly valid today. So if we move on to the next slide, we'll see a picture of that. I'm sure many of you will be familiar with this diagram. It's taken from the Gantt guide. It's appropriate to category 5 software, customized software. And as you can see on the right-hand side of this diagram, verification testing on the right-hand side starts after we've done the coding of the software or the configuration. But typically we come down the left-hand side of the V model, we complete the design specifications before we configure the code, configure the software, develop the code, and then we move into formal testing. And the sort of testing we do there is usually very structured and very scripted. And the reality is very often in the life sciences industry, we can be more concerned with making sure that we've covered all of the requirements through our requirements traceability and literally tick the boxes to say all of our requirements have been verified. And sometimes we're more concerned with that than we are with actually good testing of the software to find software bugs and issues and to address them. And there are ways to test software. So if we move on again, now that process still works well. So very often in the laboratory for analytical instruments or for process control and automation systems, we will still follow a more linear approach. We still will do typically IQ, OQ, PQ. I was just saying to Robbie that this morning I've been actually teaching some PLC students about this, specifically around process automation systems, and it's still a very valid approach. But in the world of, if you like, software-only systems, where we don't have an associated instrument or process plant, that's not the way we tend to test software in the real world. Anybody who's written code knows that developers like to test their own software informally. Very often, once they've done that, they can tend to lose interest. But that can be quite valuable. The reality is that developers do find some of their own errors, some of their own mistakes, and sometimes using concepts like pair programming, will have peers working together to refine code and to improve it. And one of the problems we have with the traditional type of testing, as we've seen, IQ, OQ, PQ, after all the code is finalized, is that it doesn't necessarily identify all of the bugs or issues in software. And typically what we find, we only find the bugs and issues in the software that we expect to find. And even with a good risk assessment, which we looked at on the last webinar about how we can use ProcedureCapture to manage our requirements, manage our risk assessments, and trace those to our tests. Typically, even with a risk assessment, we only tend to identify and look for the bugs that are associated with the risks. And very often when we're developing complex code or configuring complex systems, there are other issues in the software which are an artifact of the software configuration or development process, rather than being inherent with the risks we've identified. And what we also find is if we wait until we do formal testing to identify these bugs and issues, it's relatively expensive to fix those issues. Typically, the later in the software development lifecycle we find these issues, the more expensive it is to fix. We have to go through a change control process, project change control, do extra documentation. And it's much better if we can find all these obvious and less obvious bugs earlier in the development lifecycle, where we can fix some of the obvious things before we enter very formal change control. So if we go to the next slide, I'm sure many of you will know that we're moving much more towards agile software development life cycles. There are very formal agile models, there are less formal models, and very much in our industry we've tended to adapt these to support validation, which can be done very well. Now, my recollection over the last 10 years actually is very few systems really follow the waterfall life cycle model, even where the validation plan and validation reports said that that was the approach being followed. In reality, there were elements of an agile or an agile type approach being followed. So we would do conference room pilots, for instance, and we would try and identify as many of these issues as possible before we went into formal testing. What used to happen, we used to try and hide the fact that we did that because it didn't follow the model in the versions of GAMP. Even where we used to get the users involved with some of this early testing, we almost used to pretend that it didn't exist. And so many times I've heard the phrase informal testing as if it's something bad, as if it's something to be hidden. And the reality is it does add value, it does improve to better quality software. And GAMP 5, which has been around for a good number of years now, does recognise that we can adopt essentially any SDLC as long as it's defined, as long as it's got appropriate quality control built in. And we're seeing more and more organisations leveraging Agile to do some of this early testing. The problem we have there is that whatever we call it, whether it's conference room pilots, smoke testing, ability testing, I even have one customer who refers to it as monkey testing, i.e. just getting monkeys to press keys at random on keyboards. But one of the drawbacks is it is normally, by its definition, unstructured. And the problem we have there is, first of all, it lacks scope and objectives. So we don't always give the users who typically look at this a good idea of what they should be testing, what they should be looking for, and that guidance from the developers can be very useful. Sometimes it can be repetitive and inefficient. I was involved in some similar testing last year, and what we actually found was that 3 or 4 people were all testing the same part of the system, but nobody was testing a higher risk part of the system. That was obviously inefficient, and from the basis of risk wasn't great. And the other issue is, even when we do this type of testing, generally we do a poor job of documenting the bugs, which make reproducibility an issue for the developers. So typically a user will, be following the process, find some unexpected behavior, find a bug, but when they try to report it to the developer, they're trying to remember what keys they pressed, what data they entered, what the behavior of the system was. And that can make it very difficult for the developers actually to understand the issue, to reproduce it and fix it. So although this type of unstructured testing has value, it will certainly find software bugs that structured testing often will not find. It's not always as efficient or as easy as it could be. So if we just move the slide on, as usual, there must be a better way. In terms of what we would like to do, what's the goal here? Any project, any organisation developing software would like to leverage, to utilise both more complete and more effective and efficient risk-based testing with the objective of developing better quality software and systems. And this is about real effective verification and real quality as part of the validation process, rather than just a tick box exercise to say we've tested against all of the requirements. What we're trying to do here is really deliver better quality software that genuinely meets the needs of the users and does what it's supposed to do at first release. And the first thing we need to do if we're going to leverage these techniques is to admit that that's what we're doing. In our validation plans, we need to define and position as part of the software development cycle this build verification testing, which the developers do. They are verifying their own code, or they're getting a peer to do that. And also the usability testing that is an inherent part of good agile software development, where we get feedback from the users while we're prototyping, while we're developing the software, to actually improve the software and better meet their needs before we go into a more formally documented set of test cycles. For a validated system, we still need to do. So we need to plan the scope and objective of this testing to make it efficient and productive. We want to be able to capture evidence of the build verification testing which the developers do, because if the validation plan says that we're going to do this because it adds value, it improves quality, we need to capture evidence of this testing by the developers. And also we want to be able to capture evidence of usability testing by the users, again, so that the developers can see what the users saw, they can reproduce the behaviors of the system, understand what happened, figure out why, and fix some of these bugs earlier in the software development life cycle, where it's less expensive to fix these issues rather than formal testing. And yet again, and we'll hand back to Robbie now, Robbie and the team at Raltus have listened to the needs of the industry, and ProcedureCapture does what we need it to do. So, Robbie, over to you.
Thanks very much, David, for that introduction. If I just take you through a few pieces in terms of what the tool is, and also maybe just touch on what people are doing in terms of agile testing, so that when I get to doing the demo at all, it'll make sense to which pieces I'm referring to. So just a quick introduction to us. We have a solution that basically works on all application browsers and platforms. It's a subject matter expert tool. There's no programming resource. We've been involved in writing testing tools for 25 years and have written a couple of quite successful ones. Here are some of our customers. Most of them are in regulated industries. And what sort of kicked this off was we had a couple of customers that wanted to use, were using an agile development, and they wanted us to try and support them. So we've worked through a number of projects in terms of supporting them. So, what is the Agile methodology? Basically, you have a sprint over a number of days, basically, and within that sprint, you do your testing and developing, and you produce a working increment of the software. And in terms of out there for software development, this is predominantly the way that most organizations are doing it. And the reason that they adopted it really was twofold. One was that they found that it actually put more quality into the software itself, so testing it often and at each release or each increment of a release put in more quality rather than just testing it all at the end. And secondly, they were able to better match the customer needs, so that they were able to, if feedback was it needed to be changed to better match it, they didn't have to do it at the end. So they were getting, I suppose, drip feedback from the customer in terms of what they're creating. So that is kind of the Agile methodology. And what happens is, for each of these iterations over whatever period it is, you have a piece that is done in the testing. And this can be a mixture of the developers themselves and QA people that work in the sprint. And here is, a sort of map of what they're looking at in terms of the pieces that they do testing. So it's different types of testing they do. So, they have functional testing, they have user acceptance testing, they do this, what David was touching on earlier, informal testing, ad hoc, they can call it. Exploratory testing is another name for it. And within, if you put, boundaries around it in terms of what you're doing and time frame it, that can be called session-based testing as well. So you have these various pieces, and you have, unit test results coming in, component test, performance test, all coming into each sprint to get a definition of done for that sprint. And what we were tasked with was really, could we take some of this evidence from a validated perspective and the documented evidence coming at each of these sprints and create a body of evidence to add to the more formal testing that would be done at the end. So, what we're talking about really is this piece here, which is your top piece, which was sort of functional tests, user acceptance tests, and those user acceptance tests might be scripted, structured tests, and they might be in a manual or an automated fashion, and also those exploratory tests that I've talked about, which are session-based tests. Could they basically get some evidence here as they go along? And this was all under the constraint of course, you have a time frame to do this within, and you have a release date that's set for each sprint, basically. So, it had to be something that was easy to use, and they didn't really have to change the way they worked, and it had to be automated enough that it came out without too much work being done on it. So what we brought out of that really was the ability to have this exploratory stroke session-based testing results of what you've done in a sprint. The structured or scripted testing, which would be sort of your regression, nearly your regression pack that's run each sprint to make sure that you haven't broken anything else. And also the traceability of the tests that you do back to really in terms of Agile, they would use user stories or relate really to user requirements, they call user stories, and functional specifications relate to acceptance tests. So, acceptance criteria which the tests relate to. So those are, could you produce that as you go along to add to then if you did, a more formal piece at the end of your release. So that was what we were tasked with the customer. So if I put it more into a pictorial for us, so, you're talking about managing these user stories, which are equivalent of user requirements, and acceptance criteria, which would be equivalent of functional tests, and then the tests that relate to the acceptance criteria. And then at each of them, could you have the, session-based tests and create an output that showed what you had done, what you had found, the defects you had found for that session-based test in a report and a video. And then if you wanted to take the pieces of the session-based test and distill them down into useful scripted tests that you could rerun on a regression basis, that you were able to do that, review and approve them as normal, and then run them either in a manual fashion or an automated fashion, and either way get the documented evidence that comes out of those scripted tests. If you find any defects, can you track them, and again generate the traceability matrices from these tests back to the acceptance criteria and the user stories above them. So that's what we were tasked with, and that's what we did. So just to touch on a few things. So as I said, the user stories and acceptance criteria, if you would be equivalent of the URS and FSs effectively, and to be able to easily have the hierarchy between them so that you can see what relates to what, and then obviously match the test to the acceptance criteria and be able to link them directly to that, and to see that sort of traceability of where you are, what has passed, what has failed for each of your sprints in terms of what's going on. So that was the way that we set out to define the user stories and acceptance criteria. And then for the capture of your tests, there was this idea of let's create a session-based test. And the session-based test is, if you like, the container for exploratory testing. And it sets out in a more formal way what you're going to do in the test. It's a time-delimited session. So you decide what you're going to do, where you're going to go, what you're going to look at. And we would then automatically generate a report and video of what you've done. I mean, one of the and this is, exploratory testing in this way is one of the best ways from an agile perspective to find faults in new functionality. And it's usually done by somebody who has intimate know-how of the application itself. And, and the idea is that you learn from your last session and you nearly know where the weak fault lines are, and you go and test it. And you test it with a certain hat on in terms of who you are as a tester. And, that generally in a testing world is a better way of finding those new defects. Then from a scripted point of view, you would run your regression test. So basically the idea of creating a session based and then being able to distill it down from the actual recording to create your scripted tests as well. So that you're reusing the asset of the session base to create the scripted tests that you can run on a regression basis. Just to say that we run from Windows platform, but if you can see any of the screens from anywhere, VNC, etc., we'll be able to see it. So that's what a session-based test is, and then of course, this is how we would get from an exploratory test to distill it down into a more structured test where the tester has steps they're following basically. And once you get it down to that regression type structured test, then you can run it in either an automated or a manual fashion. So, those scripted tests, the whole way that we work is all on a visual storyboard, even for the structured tests, so that you can see what you're doing, what the tester's doing, the steps they have to follow, and it's all in a visual nature in terms of what they're doing. So all the stakeholders can understand it, and you can see whether it passes the test objective. You can also then, once you get it down to the structured, you can script the test, you can run it in movie mode or live mode, you can basically see what type of test it is, whether it has the right scope and rigor of the test, and whether somebody can actually repeat it as a tester in the scripted world. You can then lock it and electronically sign it and review it basically. And then when you come to execute those scripted tests, you can, as I say, you can either do it in a manual mode or an automated mode. And what I mean by automated mode is we will run it as if the system is the user basically, and do the tests in the test script. When it's executed, you can electronically sign it. There's no programming required, and the test results that come out are such that an independent reviewer can clearly see what has happened, what the acceptance criteria against the test evidence, and why it passed or failed. Just quickly to touch on manual versus automated, it's best to have in scripted test, it's best to have a mix of them both, especially if you're doing it within a sprint, because the last thing you want to do is have to go around nearly looking after the automated piece to get it to work, and sometimes it's better to do a manual test. So a mix of them both, and picking the ones to automate has nothing to do with tool. It's a testing best practice basically. So that's how you execute it. We also then have a defect management as well. It enables you once you've found a defect either in session-based or in scripted testing to basically track that throughout its life cycle. And as David alluded to earlier, you can actually see from a development perspective what was the steps that either in the video or in the scripted test results themselves, what happened, what were you doing that caused, what were the steps to cause it, because quite often it's a sequence of things that causes the fault. And to be able to replicate it, you need to be able to replicate it to fix it. So given a single screenshot of an error sometimes isn't very helpful for developers. Okay, so that's a basic overview and a little touch on Agile and the pieces that we're going to look at. So what I'm going to look at really in the demo is an overview of sort of how that looks in terms of understanding what's going on in your user stories, acceptance criteria, test, defects, and then a little bit about how you can define and manage those user stories and acceptance criteria and the tests that go with those acceptance criteria to see what is going on in a sprint. I'm then going to go and create this session-based test and show you what it looks like in terms of both setting, if you like, the parameters of the session-based, and also then going ahead and recording it. And I'm going to add in, some things that I see along the way. I'm going to maybe make a defect, and I'm then going to, basically stop it early. So I'm not going to do, whatever the time segment is, and then I'm going to show you what the report looks like, the overview report, and also what the video output looks like to show what has happened during your test, so that part of your evidence of what you've done from a session-based. I'm then going to take that recording and I'm going to distill it down into a structured or scripted test. And I'm going to review and approve it and lock it and electronically sign it. And then I'm going to execute it. So I'm going to execute it, probably do it in an automated fashion to show you what that looks like. I'll maybe show you some test data so that you can see how you can parameterize a test script to run in an automated fashion. So during your sprints, you would have a set of tests that would give you if you like, a body of evidence, an increasing body of evidence, what happened when I executed. I'll then show you quickly defect management, and as I said, the outputs then I'll show you as you're going along. Okay, so let us go and get on with the demo itself. So the first thing I'll touch on really is, from the requirements perspective. Now, as I said, these are 3 interlocking grids, and they can be configured to whatever names you want. So if I'm talking about in an Agile world, I'm talking about user requirements equating to user stories, and it's just how they're written effectively. And I would have the details of each of those in terms of what it does. If I'm risk assessing it, I can risk assess the user story and how it links to its acceptance criteria, basically. So what I have my user story and what acceptance criteria it is. And these acceptance criteria are also in a grid, and you would have your different acceptance criteria for each of those user stories. And what I can do then is I can categorize these by different sprints. So I would have my different sprint, and I would have my user stories set out, and I would have the acceptance criteria that I'm going to put the tests against to see what's going on. And if I want to see how those all fit together, I can go and basically see the hierarchy of my user stories to acceptance criteria here. So it gives you that linkage between your user stories and their acceptance criteria. And if I open them, then I can also see, in terms of my real-time traceability against the tests that satisfy them. So I'm going to go and see for all my user stories in this sprint, what is happening with regards to the testing that's involved. And I can see here for each of my user stories, I have failed the overall test, the overall acceptance criteria are I'm not good to go because they're all failing. And then if I want to drill down, so let's drill down into these. So in my user story 16 here, I want to drill down into the acceptance criteria to see what has happened at the individual level of those acceptance criteria. And I can see I have two that are passing, two tests that are passing, two sets of tests that are passing against that. Sorry, one's passing and two fails. So I can see easily what is going on in terms of my user stories or user requirements to functional specifications or acceptance criteria. They're a linkage between two sets of hierarchy basically, but I can see what is happening in terms of the tests that go with them. So that's your, how it fits together. From that, again, I would have my dashboards here and I'd be able to see an overview of, what is going on in terms of my different requirements. And I can see where, what is happening in terms of and I can drill down. So this would be my user stories, this would be my acceptance criteria. And if I want to do it by type, I can say, okay, show me all my acceptance criteria. And I have which ones have failed, which ones have passed. And it's a way of being able to drill down. And I can do the same thing for, tests in terms of, my tests here. So I can, if I go to here, I can see my test overview. And again, I can see, what is happening in terms of my overall tests. I can see how many have passed, failed, not run. And I can see that then by, show me the failures that are, in different test types and different test scopes as well. And the same for defects. So that is your overview of what happens. So those can also be, and this is, you can also risk assess those user stories. So, this would be what we covered in the last webinar in terms of setting up a risk assessment. And I'm not going to repeat what we did in the last one. So if you want, there's a link you can go to watch the last one. So let's move on to the tests and let's look at these. How do you create these tests, different test types, and also what do they look like, what do the outputs look like, and how do you do it? So within my tests themselves, I have all my different tests here in terms of, what has gone on. I have different test types, so I have my structured test and I have my session-based tests, and I also have for structured-based how I'm going to run it. So the green ones here are automated and the red ones are manual tests, and you can change them and run them whatever way you want. And that allows me then to, see what is going on in terms of my test types. I can see, all my session-based ones, all my structured ones, and I can drill down and keep all those tests in there as well. And for each of the tests, I would have, all the information in terms of what test type it is. So even if I wanted to take out inputs from different components or unit tests, I can set up a unit test and take the result from it and attach the evidence from that. But the main two we're going to look at today are structured or scripted test and the session-based test. So let's go and start with the session-based test. So again, just to reiterate, these are tests that developers would run in terms of they wouldn't have set scripted steps. They will have a theme to where they're going to go. They will be time delimited. So if I want to set up a session-based test, so let's go. We'll do a session-based. So if I want to set up a session-based test, what I would do is I will obviously have, and the reason I would fill in these information in terms of what I'm doing here is I can output these properties directly into my reports. So let me just do some typing here and I'll fill in some of the fields as we go. And the reason I'll do it, as I say, is because when I get my documented evidence, it can automatically be entered in there in terms of what's going on. So let's just start in. So open C. And check the tabs and statuses. And what I can do is I can give it a test number. So I'll take the last one here and I'll add one to it. And what I can do, and so the session-based really is, it's nearly like I set up the test, define what I'm going to do, and then I do it. So you don't really give it, you set it up and define what you're doing. So the charter and the scope of what you're doing and the purpose of what you're doing. So, you know, it could be and it could be, you know, what you're doing in terms of the purpose of it. And what I would do, you know, you can also have what role you're in and all details of what you're doing, and I can set the time limit of what I'm going to do in that session. I can also add in test objectives, prerequisites, all the stuff that you would do in terms of doing it. Okay, so that's how I set up the properties of it. And once I've set up the properties of it, I can then say, okay, I've defined my session-based test. And then I can simply go ahead, and this is why they do it all in one go, basically. I can go ahead and start the session. So to start the session, I simply say start capture. And as you can see over here, we will start recording what you're doing. And there's a couple of things to point out here. So, you know, there's different modes. So I can have my setup mode, my testing mode, investigation. And this really tells people later on how much time the tester spent doing particular things. And if I come across any issues, I can either add something to check later. If I come across a defect, I can actually add it. And if I want to add in, you know, what's going on at the time, I can add it in here. So we'll start the setup and then we'll change in a minute. And what I would do is I simply hide this away and I go and start my session. So, you know, my session is to open Siebel. And I start going around Siebel and following out, you know, the things that I want to check in terms of my tabs are all there, you know, in terms of let's go. And if I come across, so I get myself set up, so I might go and say, okay, I'm set up now, let's go into my testing mode, and I would hide it again, and I start going through, you know, my testing of what's going on. And at any point when I'm doing it, if I find something that looks a bit strange, so let's say these records don't look right to me. I'm not sure it's a defect, but there's something there that I need to check later on. So what I can do is simply I can record a check that says, you know, let's have a look at these pieces later on. So those look wrong to me in recent. So in my service request check, so I can write in, you know, service request check records, and I can apply that to that. So, you know, when I'm going through, so let's say I get to here and I know for a fact that the menu should be shown here, so this is a definite defect. So I can actually directly create a defect here in terms of the defect, and I can, you know and we've automatically added on a number to our defect tracking, our defect numbers, and I'm going to create a defect here in terms of a new defect because I know this is a defect. So let's say we then go on and I'll go to, you know, accounts, let's say, I'll go to all accounts. And let's say I want to check these global icons come down for all accounts. So again, you know, this is, I can go and add the check here in terms of doing a check. Now you probably will do a lot more exploring or session-based exploring than you will find the faults that I'm finding, but it's just to show it in a short period of time. So let's say I go and check those icons. I'll then go and do a query. drill down the null account. Let's say I go and get a service request. Drill down the service request, and let's say I want to check the status is open and the status is unassigned. So I'll add a couple of checks in there. I'll do one more. Now, obviously, obviously I can keep going. I've only done 3 minutes of this, and you would do 26. But let's just stop it there. I'll close SEAL first, and we'll stop it there. So here is my end of session report. So really, this is telling you how long you spent at each of the time. It's also telling you what happened to my session, basically. And obviously this one has failed, because here is what happened in terms of my defect. And this really is to make, this is sort of your comments at the end of it while it's still fresh in your head, basically say no menu items, disable, very slow, and some things to check. So that allows you to basically create that in terms of what you're doing. And that's how I would create my session-based test. And if you look here now, you can see that we have a record of everything that I have done for this test. And it shows, each of the steps that I've done. When I've come to a screen check, it shows you what are the things to check. If I found a defect here, it's 5064 is a defect that I have found. And it's a complete record of what you've actually done in the test. And I can then, if I go to my reports, I have two sorts of reports coming from this. I have my overview report. So here's my session-based 7, and this is kind of like a report that you can discuss what has happened. But what it has is all the details in terms of all the properties that I put into it, in terms of the name and the description, and then it has the little pieces that I wanted to check. So here's on step 7, I need to check the records. Step 8, I found a defect. 11, check the global icons, and then check the status open and unassigned. It gives you my comments here, and it tells you what I was doing and what it relates to in terms of if you relate it to a story. So that would be your, and I can save this as a PDF as part of my overview evidence of what I've done. But what I can also do then is, if I wanted to, I can go back to my tests, and I can actually create a video of this. So I can create an actual record of what has happened in terms of a video of this. So I can go and simply create a video of this. And if I say export, I can create a video of this. And that's it, created the video. And this video, will show you, if I send this to somebody, it'll show exactly what I've done in terms, or it is the evidence of what I have done in terms of the test. And it goes through each of the steps, and if there's anything that I'm checked, it'll tell you what I've checked, it'll tell the defects as well. And it is a complete record of all the stuff that I have done. If you look, there's the check I did, and there's the defect I created there. So that is a complete record of your session. Now, what's interesting about it as well is, quite often when you're doing agile development, you want to be able to show people what you've done and what happened. And I can simply, here is my video here, and if I look at the properties of this, you can see that this is only, this is only 2.4 meg. So this can be sent to people. This is not a Camtasia recording at 250 megabytes or whatever it would be if you did a Camtasia recording of that. So I can pass that on as part of my evidence. So within your structure here, you have what has happened in terms of video evidence, and also the overview of what has happened for that session-based test. And that, that for an Agile, being able to just turn it to define what you're going to do in the session, turn it on, make all your notes as you're going, and then automatically have that evidence produced for you. It's not just actually from a validation perspective. It's if you're working in an industry where you don't need it, it's fantastic to have, because I can see what I find, and it all makes sense because you have that visual storyboard of what's going on and the comments and what you've done for each of them. So that's fine. That's a session-based test. Okay, so what I can then do is I can go, you know what, there's a lot of this I don't really need if I want to do a scripted test. So I could create from this a scripted test. So to create a scripted test, what I can do is I can go and take pieces of this. So I can go and take pieces of this and turn it into a scripted test. So if I take, let's say, those pieces, I can then go and create a scripted test. So this time I'm going to go and create and I'm going to change this into, this is now a structured test or scripted test. And again, I can go and, I'll go and create, obviously I have a unique test reference for it. And I can go and now directly relate that to the acceptance criteria that this will relate to as well. So I can go and pick from my acceptance criteria which one I'm going to pick in terms of the functional criteria or the acceptance criteria for that. So I can link this directly to the traceability back to what this is doing. I can also decide what type of test it is in terms of, what type of testing am I doing. And I can also decide how I'm going to replay this. So let's say we're going to make this into an automated test, and I can add other fields in as well. So that's how you would easily create a scripted test from, distill it down into a scripted test. So if I distill it down into a scripted test, I can see my details here in terms of my test script that I have created from that. And this is, this is your scripted test that you would run in a regressive UAT test. And I can simply go and check. The first thing you would really do is check that this is, because I'm going to run this in automated fashion, I'm just going to check that it's going to, so that you can see how easy it is to understand what you're doing in terms of, I'm going to run there, I'm going to check the global icons query, and it, that's going to then go down, check the open and unassigned. And then I can simply, I'll simply go and run this. And this is what, I was talking about in terms of, well, actually what I can do is I can also, I can go and also approve this. If this is my scripted test, I can go and basically I can run it in preview mode. So if I run it in preview mode, well, let's go and do that quickly. I can run it in preview mode, and this will run through and show me the scope and rigor of my scripted test. So some cans, is it the right scope and rigor? Is it going to, is it going to pass or fail the test objectives? And what does it do for each of those steps? So I can run through that, and when I'm happy that it's going to basically do that, I can then go and I can basically go and I can electronically sign that test, and I can go and I can go and approve it, and I can electronically sign this. Let's pick somebody to electronically sign this as an approved test script. And I'll do it as an approver. And you can see the little lock in this, and that little lock means that it's been signed and approved. And then I can, simply open the test script, and this time I'm going to run the test script. So this would be part of your regression in your sprint that runs for each of the part of the sprint. And when I say run, off we go. And I'm not touching anything. This is the tool running this in an automated fashion, so that when you're running in your sprint, that you're running through these automated test scripts, you're doing the checks, and you're also then getting, on top of your session-based output of the video, you're also getting your output from your scripted UAT tests. So that you can see it's going through, it's going to go to the null account. Going to click on the null account, go to service request. And this is, this is what you would do in terms of running your automated test. Now you can run it in a manual fashion, and as I said earlier, some test scripts are better run manually than in an automated fashion. And you can see that we have run through that. And this is what you're going to look like in terms of my run results, even for a scripted test. So here's my run results for a scripted test. And this is the documented evidence of what has happened. You can see in my approval here what time it was approved. You can see with the FRS that it was linked to the acceptance criteria. And for each of those test scripts, we have an expected and actual. And these actual pictures are what happened when it ran for real. So here's my screen check, and these are, you can blow these up so you can see what's going on. And I would have my, right through to my 2 other checks that I did, or 2 other proving steps that I did, and here's my results of those. And that's my evidence of what has happened, and it's electronically passed and the execution date. And I can simply go and then, I can electronically sign this as being the scripted the evidence that I wanted. And this time I'll do it as an executor. And this time I'll do it as an executor, and I'll say approved. And I can then see that, this is me electronically signing this from a scripted testing perspective as normal. I've run it in an automated fashion, and here's my results, and here's my electronic this signature with my unique user ID password and the role I'm doing it. And this only comes up if you want to, and it's only if you put in everything else correct. And I would have that evidence for all my scripted tests, and I also have the evidence for the session-based tests as well. So those are. So what I've done is really I've gone through and I've shown you, how to build a session-based test. Well, firstly, the relationship between your acceptance criteria and your user stories, and how to build then test cases that relate to in both terms of both session-based and structured testing. And I also then have for each of my sprints, I will also then be able to also output my traceability of what has gone on for my acceptance tests or my user stories in terms of the links between the functional requirement and the test scripts that relate to it. So I can also automatically output my traceability as well as part of my evidence for each of the sprints. Okay, I think I've covered pretty much everything in terms of what I wanted to do. Let's see if we have any questions. I'll just go back to David for some. David, are you still there for some comments?
Yes, I'm still here, Robbie. I think you guys are making it look way too easy, Robbie. I see a lot of people getting a lot of value out of Agile these days. And although we still need to do some, formal traditional scripted testing, and we're going to focus that on the areas of highest risk, the ability to genuinely recognise that we're doing this unstructured session-based testing is really, really useful. The fact that we can capture it, it really does pull everything together. And the fact that we can capture all the evidence from the complete life cycle in one place, look back to our risk and traceability, What you guys have developed with ProcedureCapture, I mean, really is, I think, for the first time, a tool that handles beginning to end life cycle of validation. Not only captures the evidence we need to support validation, but it actually does the testing properly as well. And although there's other tools out there that do one part or the other, I think we can tick both boxes there. Really great.
Good. Thank you for that. I have a few questions that have come in here, and I'll just bring them up, and maybe we can answer those questions in terms of Q&A. So let me just see what's in here. Okay. The first one maybe I'll give to David. How do the FDA view the use of agile life cycles and this less formal approach to testing?
I mean, my experience is they're fine with it as long as we are open that that's what we're doing. So as long as we define it, that this is the approach in our validation plan, as long as we've got some evidence that we've done it, I think the FDA inspectors who really understand software and testing recognise the value of this. Again, I think we've recognised the value of this for a long time, but we've sort of tried to hide it behind the curtain because it wasn't structured, it wasn't scripted, but it does add value and it does help us deliver better quality software. It does help demonstrate we meet our user requirements, and that's what the regulatory authorities want. If we can support that with this level of evidence, no problem at all.
Great. Here's another one. Mark, perhaps you could answer this one. Does the session-based testing recording work on all applications?
Yes, absolutely. There is no reliance on the underlying technology to use objects or data from the application specifically or APIs. It's picking up what's on the screen and pretty much will work on anything that you can see, and that includes technology you can access remotely through VNC or other connection technologies as well. So a resounding yes to that one.
Okay, one more coming in here. David, maybe you could address this one. Do we still need to execute formal test cycles when we use Agile?
I think that's a really good question. I think it is still important that we have planned and structured tests. But the reality is, I think with the level of evidence that we can now get out of ProcedureCapture, in theory, you could do session-based testing for everything. I think where you would probably struggle there is to make sure that you've covered all of the requirements and all of the higher-risk requirements. So the way I see this being used is we still need to look at our higher risk requirements. We still need to go through formal test cycles. I think we have to recognise that user acceptance testing has other value other than just testing the software. It demonstrates that the users are trained, that they can use their SOPs. So I think formal test cycles still have their place. I think most projects will still use them. But I think what we can do here is be assured that our lower risk requirements have been thoroughly and rigorously tested. So I'm not saying that we can do a better job with the high risk testing, but I think we can do more comprehensive and broader testing with this combination of session-based testing and automated testing. I think it really allows us to think intelligently about our risk-based testing in terms of what's the appropriate method of testing for the appropriate requirements. Okay,
thank you very much for David for those answering those questions and also for your introduction as well. Just to say I think that's our up. Just to thank everybody for joining, not just this webinar but also the previous two. And we will send out some links for all the webinars if you want to look at them. So just as a final, thank you very much for joining, and we hope to see you again soon. Cheerio, bye.